Okay, so now that we have our AWS dashboard logged in, here I'm logged into my AWS dashboard, and hopefully you were able to set up your account on AWS and follow the steps to set up your local computer to have the AWS config required for the serverless framework. So I do suggest, if you have not done that yet, go ahead and follow the documentation in the serverless project, but basically you should have if I were to ls this, there should be a credentials file under your .aws directory of your machine, which should contain your key and secret for AWS. And if that is set up correctly, we can start by setting up our serverless project. So if you remember from our diagram, this is the setup we want. So we want AWS Lambda with AWS Gateway, and then we want these endpoints. So in order to do this, let's first set up npm package using yarn or npm, whatever. And then we want to install Typescript. So we can say yarn add, and as a developer, Typescript. Okay, and then you want to say yarn tc init, and it should be like this. Okay, now we've created a tsconfig. I'm just going to remove all of this. Okay, so these are some of the basic stuff required. So let's make this ES6, and modules should be ES6, and these are all true structure. Yeah, let's keep that going. And we want to set the root directory to be /app. So we will create an app directory, and this could be anything, right? I'm just calling it app because that's how I kind of got used to it now. So I'm gonna make their app, and then in that directory I'm gonna create another one called handlers, and in here all of our functions for our application would go in. And then we need to create the important file, the serverless.yaml. So this is where it all starts. And if you are a VS Code user, I suggest these two plugins, Serverless Framework and Serverless IDE. They just give some autocomplete. So to start the Serverless Framework service, we can run this init, which prompts us with all the required initial fields. So we're going to call this book API, and we want to run Node.js version 20. And our stage will just always be develop, and our region we can set to EU Central 1. So the rest are just some defaults for the Lambda memory size and the Lambda timeout. So these regions, you can find them all in the AWS console. There are a bunch of regions, and you can see these string prefixes on the side. So I'm choosing EU Central 1 as that's closest to me. And yeah, now we have a basic serverless service running, but there's no functions or no resources connected to it yet. So let's actually go ahead and create our first function. And we do this by specifying the functions keyword, and then we can say SLS function, which creates a new function definition for us. So we can look at some of these important fields. The first one is the internal logical name. So in the serverless framework, we will reference this function by means of this name. So we can say get books, and this handler, where is the handler of this function? So this would be in the app handlers. So we can say app handlers / and then we're going to call this get books, and then there will be a function in the get books file called or exported as handler. So the description will be get all books from DB, and the runtime we will just have a default to the one up here. Same for the memory and timeout. And then what events will trigger this handler. Okay, so there is quite a few events that we can choose from, and we'll explore some of them later, but for now this will just be a normal HTTP event which will create a REST endpoint on API gateway with some properties we can specify. So we can say books, and the endpoint method is a get, and we don't worry about the CORS and the private field for now. So now we have our first function, but we haven't created that function file yet. So let's actually go ahead and do that and say get books.ts, and in here we export async function called handler that takes in an event, because Lambda functions can be triggered by multiple things, and this event will ultimately tell us more information about what caused this event to toggle. So let's actually console log out this event, and I'm just going to call it event URL, and we can say, I'm not sure what this was called, but let's for now just log out the event. Okay, and then here we can return object, which for API gateway response we need to have a body which should have a string, so we can just stringify this object that has foo_bar, and we need a status code of any HTTP status code. So let's just make it 200, and this event will have an implicit type of any. So let's just keep it as any for now. And now we want to test out this function, right? So how do we actually deploy this to AWS and get it live and working? Okay, so very easy. If you have everything set up correctly, we should just be able to say SLS deploy and hands in the air. Everything else should deploy without us doing anything. So here we can see it's deploying the book API, which is the name of our service, and it's deploying to the stage of develop and this region, which is pretty powerful already. We are deploying to a live environment that already has all the important security stuff and the right environments based on our settings, and yeah, it's pretty powerful. And you'll see as we start developing more and more how easy it is to get changes live, and yeah, it's just very powerful. So let's wait for this CloudFormation to deploy, and then we can explore some of the other commands to maybe deploy only one function at a time, which is a lot quicker than redeploying the entire service stack, especially as this stack or this service becomes bigger and bigger. Okay, so here we can see some output from the serverless framework. We now have one endpoint with HTTPS endpoint /dev/books. So now if I were to make this call, I'm just going to use curl down here to this endpoint. We see a JSON response of foo_bar. So this is exactly what we have responded with over here. And we should see some console log event. So in serverless, we can check the logs by either going to the AWS console, or we can say SLS logs and then the function name, which is the logical name, which is get books, and we want to tail it. So now we can see streaming new logs from this function, and I'm going to open a new terminal and then just calling that same URL. We should see a log firing off on the side, which should log out this event, which is a very big HTTP gateway event. So here we can see a bunch of stuff on this event. So we can see the method path, the resource, some helper headers, and yeah, at some point we can add authentication and destructure from the identity, the user, and if we have body data, we'll see that here. So very powerful stuff. thus far we have logging and monitoring already set up for this endpoint, and we pretty much just hit serverless deploy. So let's actually speed this up and create all of the other endpoints. It's going to be quick, so I'm just going to copy this one down. This will become the create of a book, and it will go to create book handler function, which will create new book on DB, in DB, probably in DB, and this will be post. Okay, so there we have another endpoint. So let's just add some space in between. So now we want to get a book by ID. So we can say get book by ID, and this will be get a book in DB by ID. And the path will just look a little bit different. We will now have this query or this path parameter, and we will name it book ID. And this will be the logical ID that's used in code to get this value as well. And this will be a get. So now we can do the same thing for update, which would be update a book, and this would change to update a book, and this would be a put request, and here we can say delete. We're going to delete this book, delete this book by ID, and this will be a delete request. Okay, so now in the serverless we have defined everything we needed with all of its events, and in the background it will go ahead and create all of these endpoints with their API gateway setups for us. Now we just need to create the endpoints for get book by ID.ts, and yeah, let's just copy and paste that in here. So it will be the event foo bar. Let's just call this method get book by ID, and this will just be method get books. Okay, so this is not very useful Lambda functions, but for now this would work. Okay, so let's create the update book by ID, and then we have this one, which would be the delete book by ID, and then we have the create book. Okay, so it's the get books, get book by ID, update book by ID, delete book by ID, and create book. Okay, so this would be create book. Okay, this would be delete book. This would be update book, get books, and get book by ID. Okay, so now we have functions for all of them. They return with some special message just to identify them for now. And all we need to do now is say SLS deploy and let the magic happen. So just to quickly show you on this side, when I go to my account under this same region, I can see there is a dev books API with only one API endpoint on API gateway. And as soon as this deployment here is done, so I can actually close off this terminal for now. As soon as this CloudFormation stack is deployed, after all the changes we've made here, we should see an update here with all of the other endpoints. And it was so quick, and it's already live. And yeah, now you can just continue working with the serverless framework. And here we can see all the updated endpoints, the functions and the endpoints we can see are logged out pretty nicely for us over here. So now I'm going to open my client. I'm just going to copy this base URL, set it up like this, books. Okay, so let's get the books. Okay, run this one. We see get books. Now we want to post a new book. So let's post a book. So we created a new book. So let's put to that specific ID. We update the book. Now we want to delete the book with that specific ID. We delete the book. And now we want to get a book by that specific ID. And we send and we get the book. So now we have all these endpoints and their API gateway associated stuff live. And I would encourage you to go to the console and then kind of inspect what did the serverless framework do in the background. So it created /books and then the /books/ID, and then it kind of groups the different methods. And you can go into them and take a look at some of the settings regarding that. You can inspect the Lambda function that's associated with that endpoint, and you can view some monitoring about the invocations of this function, and you can go to CloudWatch and you can see even more details. So here we can see log groups that were created, and our console log. Here we can see our console logs that we have in code that's getting logged here, and these logs are searchable and they are available for, I think by default, 14 days. So you have like everything set up instantly by just this few lines of code. So this is pretty impressive, and this is the part that we're going to get into even more as this project continues, as we set up a database and start doing some logic with file uploads and communicating between the different services. So this is all for this video. In the next video we will start adding some logic and maybe start looking at adding the database part, and that's it. Okay, so now that we have our functions and our endpoints deployed to AWS by just running the serverless deploy command, which is pretty easy, and we saw them live in AWS console. So let's switch back there again. So I'm gonna head over to the home and I'm gonna click on API gateway, and here I can see our different APIs, and one of them is our book API. And under the book API I can see all the endpoints that were generated in API gateway. And if I click on them, I can also go to the functions that link to this endpoint. So let's go and view that in the Lambda service. So that's another service that we've touched, and we can click on applications on the side, and then we can select our book API project. Underneath here we can see a bunch of the resources that it used or created. So we have a Lambda function, we have a Lambda function, Lambda function, Lambda function, and then we see a bunch of other stuff here as well. So one is the API gateway REST API. So we just took a look at that one, and all these got linked together automatically by the serverless framework. And then we have this concept of log groups for each individual Lambda function, which is great because it makes debugging and inspecting some logs very easy, and you get it set up right off the bat. Then again, each of the Lambda functions has a log group, and then ultimately we see something S3 here, and basically this S3 is all our Lambda functions. So this TypeScript code that we wrote to handle some event, that gets bundled to JavaScript by the serverless framework. It gets put into a zip file and it gets deployed to this bucket. And then in the background, the Lambda functions get deployed from this bucket. So it's like keeping its own repository of the code in S3 as well. So in the background, the serverless framework spins this up for us as well. And then again, we have our Lambda function and log group. We can explore some of the other functions as well, or services as well, and that's S3. So we can take a look at this bucket. So I'm just going to I'm just going to search for the book API bucket, and we can see this is the serverless deployment bucket with some ID, and it's in the same location that we set up, and we can do some other stuff there as well. And then in here we can navigate to the directories. Here we can see the dev folder with some timestamp, and then we see the deployed code. So this zip file, if we were to download that, we would be able to see all of our JavaScript code in there. That is just some insights into what all of this code has done for us. Now another nice command that we can use to actually delete all of these resources that was just spun up, we can just say sls remove. And once again, hands in the air, and we just watch the serverless framework do its magic by going through this file and then in logical order deleting and removing all the required resources that was created. So now we've been to the S3 bucket over here. So let's actually stay there, and as soon as this remove is done, we'll go and inspect and we'll be able to see, okay, that was quick. So it removed all of the services. And now if I were to go here and refresh again, we don't have any bucket with the book API anymore. And if we go to our API gateway and have a look at our APIs, we no longer have the book API anymore. And the same goes for the serverless functions. So if we look at the applications, we don't see our book API application anymore. Hence all of our serverless functions got removed as well. So that was quite quick and quite easy. And to deploy it again, we just say serverless deploy, and it does all of the magic again. So it's very quick, and we get a lot of advantage from the serverless framework, as you can see. So in the next part of the videos, we will start talking about our code setup and how we will structure our code so that it makes sense and is scalable. And yeah, a bunch to learn more. So I hope you're excited and stay tuned.